Quiet is engineered until it hurts. Propellers, flow, and tolerances. Start with the sound itself. A submarine's voice is a composite, broadband hiss, machinery hum, and the ladder of narrowband tonals tied to shaft speed. But the piece that lets everything else hide or stand out is the propeller. It's the metronome. Get the geometry wrong and water tells on you. Get it right and water becomes a blanket. Here's the physics without the chalk dust. Every blade edge sheds vortices, tiny spirals of low pressure that peel off and march downstream. When local pressure drops far enough, vapor bubbles form and then collapse, cavitation. Those collapses are little hammers, loud and broadband, easy to hear and hard to mistake. The onset depends on speed, depth, temperature, and critically, the exact shape and finish of the blade. A nick or thickness variation becomes a hot spot where bubbles kick off early. That's the burr on the gram readers, ladder, the sidebands and fuzz they used to love. Quieter isn't just slower. It's delaying cavitation at useful speeds, moving eddies off the frequencies our filters watched, and suppressing the amplitude of the artifacts that fingerprinted older screws. Engineers attack it three ways: geometry, finish, and matching. Geometry first. A skewed blade, curved back like a scimitar, spreads the loading along the edge, lowering peak pressure. Twist isn't uniform. It's dialed section by section so inflow hits a gentle camber instead of a cliff. Near the root, thicker sections carry torque. Near the tip, slim sections reduce tip vortex strength. That trim at the tip matters. The tip vortex used to be a beacon. Finish is where machine tools turn math into ocean. A hand-polished blade looks smooth to the eye and still hides millimeter sins. A CNC milled blade, cut with a 9-axis head that keeps the cutter normal to the surface, produces a finish whose roughness sits below the threshold where micro-eddies persist. Trails that once sang as faint sidebands just don't form. Under strobe in a cavitation tunnel, the cloud that used to blink on at a certain advance coefficient lingers, a knot or two later. Matching ties it together. Props don't live alone. They work with a shaft line and gear train whose eccentricities show up as modulation. If you cut 5 blades perfectly and mount one with a hair of pitch error, the whole ladder wobbles. Precision lets you match pitch and thickness across the set and balance the hub so shaft once per rev tones drop under ambient. That wipes out the heartbeat gram readers called class. And here's the twist. This is why MBP 110 class precision mattered more than any speech. People talk about quieter metals, but the material is mundane, bronze, stainless. What changed was tolerance. Hold thickness within tens of microns, hold edge radius inside a spec sheet's whisper, and the trailing edge stops shedding the little separations that made those tidy sidebands. Skew pushes the wake across time. Finish erases the seeds. Tolerance ensures every blade contributes the same story. The machine paths matter. With a 5-axis mill and a clamped blank, you can rough a blade close and let fitters blue the highs. With 9 axes and a stiff rotary, you can chase compound curvature in one sweep. Controllers translate NURBS surfaces into feed and tilt so the cutter never gouges. Surface scallop height is controlled, tool deflection compensated. The result isn't art, it's repeatability. You don't get one perfect prop. You get a fleet of them, each a twin. Water gives feedback quickly. In a cavitation tunnel, engineers paint blades with fluorescent dye and watch where bubbles first bite. Before precision, those streaks clustered at the same scars. After, streaks shifted or vanished until throttle settings rose. Sea trials told the rest. Tonals thinned, broadbands smoothed. The ladder's rungs still existed. Physics doesn't disappear, but the burrs on the edges, the human helpfulness, faded. There's another benefit precision buys: discipline. When you know the prop won't betray you at a small throttle change, you can adopt operations that skate under someone else's filter logic. No gratuitous surges near choke points, coordinated depth shifts across the layer, shaft RPM held at values that push harmonics into gaps between beams. The hardware enabled the behavior completed it. For the arrays, effect showed up as the negative space the watchstanders felt. Sidebands gone, modulation shallow, blade rate tones thinner and tucked just under threshold. Our thresholds weren't wrong. They were loyal to an ocean we thought was permanent. Tolerances moved the signal just enough that the number pages didn't light when they used to. Filters trained to ignore merchant prop seethe lost the seam that separated them from ours. Engineers at home took the same lessons. US props already used skew and finish, but the shock of losing the burrs forced a turn in doctrine. Acoustic processors stopped worshipping the ladder and started asking if the motion belonged. Pattern of life trumped signature. The metric became, is this behavior out of family for this water at this hour? Raw detection range shrank. Confidence returned anyway. Quiet at the source doesn't make a boat invisible. It buys choice. It lets a captain cross a bearing line at a watch change and know a gram reader won't get his moment. It lets a missile carrier slide into better water with fewer cues thrown off the wall. And it forces an adversary to stop listening for what's easy and start listening for what's left. Breathing, not singing. That's how tolerances become weapons. Not by breaking physics, but by narrowing the room where our habits worked. Meanwhile, on paper, it still looked like business. Milling centers, controllers, invoices stamped for shipyards. On the gram, it sounded like an absence. The rest of the story is what absence does to politics, to allies, and to the way a navy learns to hear again. The Soviet quieting curve, classes, trials, and proof. Before anyone said Akula, operators were already arguing about a different hull. Victor III. Mid-1970s tapes showed a step change. Less hash around the ladder, cleaner blade rate, and a steadiness that felt rehearsed. We wrote it off as refit variants until trials stacked up. A Victor crossed the gap, and the tonals stayed thin through maneuvers that used to puff noise. The curve had started. Sea trials are where engineering meets water without stories. Soviet boats ran measured profiles in the White Sea. Incremental throttle changes, depth sweeps through the layer, recorded in instrumented ranges. Those baselines, paired with factory tolerances and new blade shapes, moved the onset of cavitation later and shaved modulation that once named them at long range. The first proof didn't arrive on a gram. It arrived in what didn't light when it should. Western snapshots caught the before and after like mismatched Polaroids. In UK waters, a SIGINT ship pulled clean lines where fuzz used to live. A P3 crew reported a Victor that held RPM through a turn without the old wobble, a little human moment missing from the spectrogram. SOSUS bearings that had rung them at long range now needed help. Close-in assets started doing heavy lifting the wall had done alone. Here's where confusion at home got loud. Some analysts said we were watching real Soviet progress. Rafted machinery refined, pumps isolated, clean power, and better shaft mounts. Others insisted we were victims of our threshold worship, primed by the tooling scandal to hear what hurt. In rooms with no windows, people teased out timing. The Toshiba Kongsberg shipments hit in the early 80s. Victor IIIs were improving before then. Akula's leap came after. The fair reading was awkward. Both could be true. The curve bent first on general quieting and bent sharper when precision props entered the fleet. Operators didn't debate curves. They chased boats. In the Barents, a US sub rode a Victor III's tail and logged behavior that didn't match training tapes. Blade rate lines looked diet thin. The classic 1 per rev heartbeat slumped under ambient. When the target pushed through the layer, the pop didn't broadcast like before, just a sigh that vanished in distant shipping noise. The skipper keyed a note that read like understatement. Mod artifacts reduced. Then came the hull the West would learn to say with respect. Akula didn't erase physics. It erased the crutches we leaned on. Anechoic tiles layered in smarter patterns. Machinery modules sat on rafted foundations within rafted compartments, double isolated to keep structure-borne noise from reaching skin. The screw geometry, skewed, finished, matched, completed the kit. In trials, she tracked quieter than Victor III by a margin that cancelled distance our arrays loved. Proof moments are rarely cinematic. A gist, SOSUS logged a transit at ranges that used to be comfortable. Cross fixes were late. A SURTASS ship, the long line listener, painted a faint, steady ladder, no burrs, no attitude. A P3 fan buoys into the wrong box, then cranked a sector nobody liked flying because the water lied. Contact bloomed just long enough to pass a bearing. Back at the lab, processors compared today's tapes with last year's. Same class, same behavior, half the modulation. Training libraries started to look like nostalgia. Allied notes stitched the picture. The UK reported Northern Fleet boats clipping edges of the GIUK pattern at hours that suggested new confidence. Norway's coastal ears, living inside the adversary's weather, heard less of what once gave them early warning. Canada's Atlantic nets fed anomalies that matched our clean lane, season, ghosting at shift change windows and thin queues where merchant seethe should have provided contrast. Everyone grumbled, then did the math. Detection probability down, range down, time on top up. Inside the Navy, doctrine hated ambiguity. Old rules assumed early fix, long handoff, and ambush geometry shaped by a wall that talked first. Now the wall murmured. Crews pushed forward, trailing tighter, accepting more risk to keep contact quality. Collision near misses crept up. A few cables grew taut in stories no one told outside. The force adapted hard. Subs learned to be ambush predators at greater depth. SURTASS spread ears into corridors that moved with water, and P3 tactics shifted toward multi-phenomena confirmation. Acoustics plus ESM plus behavior before anyone said weapon quality. The Toshiba story sharpened this shift, but didn't define it alone. Sailors weren't reading hearings, they were reading grams. The reveal that precision mills had been sold into Leningrad amped heat on allies and tightened export controls. It also gave engineers a vocabulary to explain the absence. With better props, old doctrines misread the water. Clean lanes weren't maintenance miracles. They were the engineered negative space of a rival who'd learned the same physics we loved, and then taught crews to behave like ghosts. Washington wanted names to pin to fury. Admirals avoided blaming one machine for a decade of Soviet engineering. The honest line sounded like this. Victor III marked a serious step. Akula marked a steeper one. Precision machining was a force multiplier layered onto rafted machinery, tiles, and disciplined operations. Together, those bent the curve enough that the ocean we'd trained on felt like it had moved a wall. What mattered for the people holding headphones was less the chart and more the choice. You could cling to class ID by ladder and lose confidence, or you could pivot to, does this motion belong here now? The Navy chose the latter. Proof didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived as 1,000 small decisions to stop worshipping voices and start hunting behavior, because the boats we were up against had learned how to keep their voices down. Discovery, investigations, leaks, and the hill erupts. It didn't start with a headline. It started with a letter, polite, precise, and dangerous. A trading firm employee in Tokyo wrote to a quiet office in Paris where COCOM kept its lists. He named meetings in 198, contracts inked in 81, routing through third countries, and machines shipped as spares to civilian yards that didn't need 9-axis mills. He underlined one detail. The controllers came separately, Norwegian, with paperwork that looked right until you read the dates twice. He didn't say submarines. He didn't have to. The specs made their own indictment. COCOM investigators traced serial numbers like fingerprints through freight manifests and insurance slips. In Oslo, a police inquiry tugged at a Kongsberg thread and found NC brains in crates stamped innocuous. In Tokyo, a Toshiba machine audit turned up gaps, purchase orders without end-user certificates, shipping labels peeled and replaced, and logs that stopped when questions started. Somewhere along the way, documents burned. Not metaphors, actual ash in a barrel behind a loading dock. The story reached Washington through 2 doors at once. Intelligence officers slid a folder across a Navy desk with the tone of someone handing back a broken tool. Commerce briefers called it a violation with teeth. The Navy didn't need the adjectives. Operators had been living the absence for months. Now they had nouns and addresses. The questions shifted from what's happening to how far did it go? And how do we say this out loud without teaching the other side more? But wait, here's the twist. This wasn't cloak and dagger. It was purchase orders and stamps. Leaks did what leaks do. A reporter got a call that sounded like a favor and wrote a piece with enough detail that committee chairs cleared calendars. The Hill loves a villain with a logo. Cameras waited on the steps while staffers drafted phrases like most important setback and alliance betrayal. Inside, the tone disciplined itself. Witnesses swore in. A Navy flag officer said the quiet part carefully. Our ears were fine. Their blades changed. He avoided prophecy and put the price tag in ranges no one liked. Billions to retune processing, to push arrays harder, to alter doctrine, to buy time. Allies flinched in real time. Japan sent emissaries who led with apology and followed with timing. Akula keels were laid before shipments arrived, they said, as if curves obeyed calendars. Norway arrived with bureaucracy and contrition. Both heard the same reply: we don't get to unhear what our arrays don't hear. Congress floated bans that would please evening news. One member smashed a Toshiba radio with a sledgehammer for cameras, theater standing in for policy. Behind closed doors, the splits were subtler. State warned that detonating trust would shrink the GIUK picture we still needed. Pentagon civilians wanted blood without wrecking basing rights. Commerce wanted rules that bit, not grandstand. The Navy wanted time and money and a way to shift culture without telling the adversary where we'd moved. The compromise read like a spreadsheet. Fines, export bans, compliance regimes with audits that made CEOs sweat, and a COCOM tightened until grey traders felt colorblind. A micro-story from Tokyo showed how the rot looked up close. A sales manager, asked to retype an invoice so a machine looked 5 axis instead of 9, stared at the paper too long. He signed anyway, convinced it was clever and temporary. When investigators came, he told himself the fire that ate the file was housekeeping. Later, in a bland conference room under fluorescent mercy, he said he hadn't known where the metal would sing. Across an ocean, a Graham reader could have told him. Journalists chased villains and got some. They also hit complexity. European firms had sold similar tools within legal margins. Drawings leaked from other places years earlier. Walker's spy ring had told the Soviets what our ears loved long before a cutter ever touched bronze. The committee chair let those caveats land without dimming the heat. Two truths coexisted. The Soviets were on a quieting curve already. Precision props made the dip steeper and sooner than our habits allowed. Classified sessions ran colder. Analysts walked members through the geometry without handing over an instruction manual. Sidebands shaved, blade rate thinned, modulation tucked, threshold logic loyal to yesterday, behavioral discipline turning good hardware into ghosting. The ask wasn't just punishment. It was permission to pivot the force toward fusion and anomaly hunting and to budget for things that didn't come with a ribbon cutting. Japan's Diet held hearings no one in Peoria watched. Executives testified about rogue subsidiaries and rogue incentives.